Right, so Microsoft has spent years telling the world it's the sensible one in big tech, the adult in the room, the company that doesn't get itself dragged into political mud fights because it's too busy selling trust and responsibility by the terabyte. Yet here it is, knee deep in a surveillance scandal tied to an occupation the world is now calling out in the strongest terms, and suddenly all that corporate calm looks like a very expensive illusion. When the biggest sovereign wealth fund on earth is voting against your own chief executive because they can't explain what you've been doing with Israeli military data, you're not managing a risk anymore, you're managing fallout. And the thing Microsoft never imagined could happen to them is exactly what's happening. The politics they thought they could ignore has turned around, pulled the evidence out of their own cloud, and asked them to explain why they ever thought neutrality covered any of this. Right, so Microsoft has spent years cultivating this image of corporate stability, the big name, isn't it? The reassuring brand, the sort of company that can stand above all the chaos of the tech sector because it doesn't make reckless bets and it doesn't chase controversy and it doesn't let itself get dragged into the kind of geopolitical mess that ends careers. Yet here it is, watching the consequences pile up because it decided to embed itself in Israel's digital security apparatus and pretend that the politics wouldn't follow them home. That was a mistake. The politics always follows you home. You don't get to power the infrastructure of an occupation. You don't get to process the communications of an entire population under military rule. And you don't get to maintain the architecture of state surveillance without eventually finding yourself answering questions that no corporation really wants to answer. Microsoft is now finding itself in that position, it seems. And the thing that makes the whole situation more remarkable is that they walked into it thinking their size would protect them. The turning point wasn't one scandal, it was the realization by the biggest sovereign wealth fund in the world, Norway's of course, that Microsoft's relationship with Israel wasn't just ethically dubious, but a genuine governance risk. When a fund holding tens of billions of dollars in your stock says it won't back your leadership team because you refuse to disclose the human rights risks associated with your operations, you can drop the idea that your politics are invisible. The fund is voting against the reappointment of the chief executive of Microsoft, voting against his pay package, and voting for a human rights resolution that management doesn't want anywhere near their AGM. They don't need to say the word Israel for everyone to understand what this is all about. The entire demand for disclosure sits on the reality that Microsoft's systems have been tied to the Israeli military's surveillance of Palestinians, and the fund doesn't want the reputational cost of being associated with a company that can't account for its exposure. Norway's Council of Ethics would have a field day. And the ethics really do matter in Norway. This is the most powerful institutional investor in the world, applying formal pressure on a company it would have every financial incentive to protect if they were devoutly capitalist, but ethics matter more to them. Therefore, you can see what's going on here. They've calculated that the risk from Microsoft's relationship with Israel is now greater than the cost of publicly challenging the board. That's a serious shift, isn't it? Because these funds normally prefer quiet diplomacy behind the scenes. The moment they take things public, it means the internal warnings weren't enough, and they now need to be seen taking a position. It also signals something else. The assumption that Israel's contracts are politically safe has collapsed. Investors understand that the Gaza genocide allegations have moved the boundary of what counts as acceptable corporate behaviour, and no fund wants to be caught holding shares in a company accused of enabling surveillance that fed into lethal targeting. Microsoft is used to being the safe asset in a turbulent sector. It is therefore telling that the Norway fund picked them out as a problem. But the governance result, that's only the surface layer here. The real threat to Microsoft comes from the complaint that's been lodged in Ireland, because once a regulator gets involved, the space for evasive corporate answers vanishes completely. This complaint alleges that Microsoft processed personal data on behalf of the Israeli military in ways that facilitated severe human rights abuses, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. It states that Microsoft's cloud services were used by Israeli military intelligence to intercept and store millions of phone calls from Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, and that this data was part of a surveillance ecosystem that feeds into targeting decisions according to the complaint. That's an extraordinary allegation for a regulator to be asked to assess, and the Irish authority has confirmed it is looking at the complaint. The moment the process begins, Microsoft's strategy of holding everything behind corporate secrecy falls apart, because GDPR does not care about the political sensitivities of a close US ally. It cares about lawful processing, data minimization, consent, purpose limitation, and accountability. If the data was processed unlawfully, Microsoft cannot hide behind the client. This is the point where Microsoft's insistence on neutrality collapses, because the facts already in the public domain make neutrality impossible. There's been detailed reporting about how Israel's Unit 8200, Israel's clandestine and secretive intelligence unit, intercepts the communications of Palestinians as part of a mass surveillance program. And the reporting shows Microsoft's cloud systems were used to store those intercepts. When cloud infrastructure becomes part of a system that collects, analyzes, and operationalizes the communications of a population living under military rule, the platform's no longer neutral, is it? It's allegedly an enabler of the system, and that's exactly what the complaint argues. It says Microsoft provided the infrastructure that made the surveillance possible, and therefore contributed to the effects of that surveillance, which included the lethal use of intelligence. This is not a hypothetical chain, this is the documented way Israel's digital occupation works, and Microsoft is alleged to have been part of it. Then there's the allegation that Microsoft helped move or conceal data after the scandal was exposed. Whether this allegation ultimately stands or not, its presence in the public discourse is still damaging because it signals to regulators that there may have been attempts to avoid transparency. Companies get into serious trouble when regulators suspect obstruction, and even the whiff of it can turn a compliance review into a much deeper investigation. Microsoft has to answer the question of what happened to the stored data, and they cannot answer it without revealing the extent of any operational involvement. And that's the trap. If they admit too much, they open themselves to legal consequences. If they admit too little, they're accused of hiding the truth. The entire point of GDPR is to prevent powerful institutions from doing exactly what the complaint describes, processing personal data of vulnerable populations without scrutiny and using it for purposes the data subjects cannot challenge. The other part of the complaint focuses on the digital permit system that Israel uses to control Palestinian movement. This system sits at the heart of the occupation. It governs who can travel, when, and under what conditions. It sits inside a broader architecture of surveillance that includes facial recognition, biometric data, and real-time location tracking. And Microsoft's role in supporting components of that system is now being put before regulators. Again, the company is not being accused of building the occupation. It is being accused of providing the infrastructure that allows the occupation to operate with digital efficiency. That's the core political and legal problem. The technology is not abstract, it's a tool of control. And once you see that architecture, the investor revolt and the regulatory complaint stop looking like separate events and start looking like symptoms of the same problem. The political climate has shifted. The Gaza genocide allegations have changed the boundary of what investors, regulators, and the public are willing to tolerate. The Israel tech partnership model that flourished for 2 decades is no longer sustainable because the human rights cost is now too visible. And Microsoft stands at the center of that shift because it is the company whose infrastructure has been directly named in the surveillance systems tied to the occupation. The Norway fund wants transparency. The Irish regulator wants compliance. Human rights groups want accountability. And Microsoft wants the whole thing to go away, which it won't. So here's the thing. Microsoft can't explain this away as a misunderstanding. The allegations sit inside a well-documented pattern of how Israel operates its digital control infrastructure. The interception of Palestinian communications isn't new. The use of mass data for population monitoring isn't new. The integration of cloud services into occupation systems isn't new. What is new is that Microsoft is being forced to confront these facts in public rather than managing them through private contracts and quiet technical work. They built a brand on trust and responsibility, but trust collapses the moment a company is accused of providing the infrastructure for a state surveillance of an occupied people. Responsibility collapses when the company cannot say whether the data it processed was later used in lethal operations that the world is now scrutinizing under the lens of genocide. And this exposes something bigger about the tech sector itself. The assumption that corporations could sit above geopolitics is finished. Big tech has spent years pretending their tools are neutral, their platforms are neutral, their cloud services are neutral, and that any misuse of their systems is the client's responsibility. That position is no longer credible when the client is a military authority running an occupation. The political meaning of the technology becomes unavoidable at that point, and because the political meaning has become unavoidable, the legal meaning becomes unavoidable. GDPR is built on the principle that people have rights over their data. An occupied population has no such control. That puts Microsoft squarely into the center of a legal and ethical crisis it cannot cleanly escape from. So you can see why this frightens investors, can't you? The Norway fund went public because they know human rights risk translates into financial risk. If Microsoft ends up facing penalties or enforcement measures in Europe, the consequences will go straight to governance, brand value, and market confidence. And because the allegations are tied to possible crimes under international law, the reputational cost could spread far beyond Europe. Microsoft's business model relies on being the dependable infrastructure provider for governments around the world. If their name becomes associated with the machinery of a state accused of genocide, that business model starts to weaken, to say the least. It's not just investors who see that problem. Governments will be watching these stories carefully. Public sector clients are sensitive to the politics of their vendors. They cannot afford to be seen buying services from a company under investigation for possible complicity in human rights abuses. So the risk is not isolated to the European regulatory process. It ripples through procurement systems and legal departments and political assessments. Microsoft's attempt to present itself as a safe, predictable provider has been badly undermined by evidence that alleges it allowed its systems to be embedded inside a military surveillance regime. The irony is that Microsoft had all the tools it needed to avoid this. It has human rights policies, it has responsible AI frameworks, it has compliance units and governance committees. What it lacked was the willingness to apply those frameworks to a politically sensitive client. Israel has spent years positioning itself as a tech powerhouse, a strategic partner, a hub of innovation, the startup nation. That branding helped obscure the reality that much of its technological development is tied directly to the mechanisms of control in the occupied territories. Microsoft accepted the branding and chose not to question the politics underneath it, and now it faces the consequences of that, because the politics has moved faster than its risk assessment has. And that's the real lesson in all of this. Microsoft believed its size insulated it. It believed its reputation would keep regulators cautious. It believed that Israel was too important an ally for investors to challenge. It believed that claims about surveillance and occupation wouldn't generate enough global pressure to matter. It believed that a corporation could operate inside a system built on inequality and coercion without becoming part of the story. All of those beliefs have now collapsed. Israel has become a liability for Microsoft, not because the company changed, but because the world stopped accepting the idea that digital infrastructure can be separated from the political structures it supports. So the question isn't whether Microsoft is in trouble. It is. The question is how the trouble evolves. They're facing demands from investors, scrutiny from regulators, questions from lawmakers, pressure from human rights groups, and skepticism from the public. They're facing a moment where they cannot hide inside technical language or use their scale as a shield. They're facing a situation where their friendship with Israel has stopped being a strategic asset and started being a reputational hazard that reaches into the core of their own business model. And they're facing a world that's finally recognized that big tech is not neutral, not apolitical, and not exempt from accountability when its systems are used in acts that may amount to crimes. Microsoft treated Israel as a safe partner, a stable client, a source of profit and influence. What they actually embraced, according to these allegations, was a digital infrastructure of occupation that has now become politically indefensible and legally dangerous. Being tied to that system is no longer something the company can paper over with corporate statements or ethics pledges. The consequences have arrived. The investors have spoken, the regulators are watching, the public has shifted, and Microsoft is discovering the hard way that when it is being alleged that you helped build the machinery of control, you don't get to walk away when the world finally looks at what that machinery has been doing. Of course, it's not just real companies with connections to Israel that are causing problems for those in positions of power. Non-existent ones are managing to do likewise too. Confused about that? Don't be. All the details can be found right here. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people. I'll hopefully catch you on the next one. Cheers, folks.